Now the porch swing plays an empty tune, still swaying with the scent of you. Love is costly, I counted each dime, paid it all but lost what's mine.
A woman's heart is a garden, Ellie, and forgiveness is the only rain that'll keep the weeds down. Ellie took that to heart like a vow whispered on the hottest day of summer. She married Ben when she was 19, a handsome man with a smile that could melt the ice off a January windshield, and eyes that always seemed to be looking just past her shoulder. They built a life in Willow Creek, a town that ran on gossip and sweet tea, where everyone knew everyone's daddy, and everyone watched Ellie and Ben. She thought their love was as solid as the oak they built their porch swing from, something strong enough to weather any storm. She thought her kindness was her shield. That slow-moving heat of the delta settled over everything, thick and silent, holding its breath for the trouble that was surely coming. It always did. The first time, the discovery was as quiet as dust settling on a forgotten shelf. It wasn't a shouting fight or a dramatic letter. It was the smell of another woman's lilac perfume clinging to his favorite denim shirt, the one he wore for Sunday suppers. Ellie caught the scent as she folded the laundry, the subtle, sweet lie twisting in the air between them. Her hands, usually so steady when kneading dough or quilting, began to tremble. Ben came home late that night, full of excuses about a late delivery down in Natchez. He kissed her forehead, and his kiss felt like a forgery. She didn't challenge him. She waited until the sun came up, watched the light spill over the pine floors, and she just ironed the shirt, smoothing the lilacs sent away with steam and silence. When Ben woke up, she served him breakfast, scrambled eggs perfect and fluffy, and she looked him dead in the eye, and she forgave him in her heart before he ever spoke a single word of apology. That, she believed, was the proper way to handle an error in love. Bless her heart, she did it again. The next time, the betrayal had a name. Sadie. Sadie worked at the bank, a woman with hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that carried too far down Main Street. This time, the whisper came from Clara, Ellie's oldest friend, who couldn't bear to see Ellie walking blind. Clara sat on the porch swing, the chain squeaking a mournful rhythm, and held Ellie's hand while the sun dipped low. She didn't mince words. He was seen, Ellie Mae, down by the old fishing dock, just as bold as you please. The sound of Sadie's name felt like a stone dropping into a well, hitting the bottom with a sickening, final splash. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin feeling tight and cold, even in the humid air. She didn't cry. She just stared out at the dark line of the woods, where the cicadas had started their frantic nightly song. What hurt most wasn't the act, but the carelessness, the lack of Ben knelt on the worn rug in the living room, his head bowed, the picture of a repentant sinner. He cried real tears, the kind that promised change and everlasting devotion. He swore on his mama's grave, on the dust of Willow Creek, and on the strength of their history. He spoke of the devil in his soul, the weakness of his flesh, and how Ellie was the only true star in his dark night sky. It was a beautiful speech, practiced and poignant, and it hit all the right notes in Ellie's heart, which was still tuned to the frequency of redemption. She looked at his bent head, his strong shoulders shaking with what appeared to be genuine sorrow, and the old, familiar feeling rose up in her chest, pity which often masqueraded as love. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle, almost maternal. She told him she loved him, and that she knew the path of righteousness was hard, and she would walk it with him. The words felt heavy on her tongue, but she said them anyway, because that's what a good woman did. That slow-moving heat of the delta witnessed her sacrifice. Bless her heart, she did it again. She forgave him, and the town sighed. The forgiveness didn't bring the peace she always expected. This time, it brought a silent, creeping resentment that coiled around her stomach like a snake. When Ben touched her, she felt a hollow space open up in the center of her being, a place where trust used to live, now echoing and cold. The folks in Willow Creek didn't look at her with sympathy anymore. They looked at her with a kind of weary judgment. Mrs. Henderson at the general store gave her change with a slow, pitying shake of the head. The men in town started treating Ben with a kind of backslapping camaraderie, as if his transgressions made him more of a man, and her forgiveness made her less of a woman. Ellie started spending long afternoons by the riverbank, watching the water flow slow and thick toward the Gulf. She was searching for a sign, a whisper in the wind, anything to justify the immense emotional cost of keeping this marriage afloat. She was looking for her mama's voice, but all she heard was the rustle of the dry reeds and the distant, mocking sound of Sadie's laugh. Then came the time that broke the pattern of shame and secrecy. Ben didn't just cheat. He brought the consequence home, a tangible proof of his disregard. He lost his job at the mill, not because of poor work, but because his affair with Sadie, who, it turned out, was the mill owner's niece, had caused a public spectacle at the annual company picnic. The whole town saw it, a messy, drunken confrontation that ended with Ben throwing a plate of barbecue ribs into the owner's prize-winning hound. The spectacle was not just embarrassing, it was ruinous. It stole their security. Ben didn't just crawl home asking for forgiveness. He came home asking for money and a safe place to hide from the mess he'd created. His weakness wasn't just moral now, it was financial and existential. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice from the mill-owned house. She let him talk for hours, weaving tales of misfortune and betrayal, painting himself as the victim of Sadie's seductive wiles and the mill owner's spite. Ellie sat silent, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the shadows lengthen and swallow the room. She noticed the way Ben only spoke about the consequences for himself. The loss of money, the loss of standing, never once the consequence for her, the woman who had buried a piece of her soul every time he returned. That night, she didn't offer comfort. She didn't scream or rage. She simply said, her voice dry as the winter grass, "Go sleep in the spare room, Ben. I need the silence." That was the first boundary, the first tiny stone she had placed in the path of his return. It wasn't a punishment. It was a protective measure. Ben looked stunned, accustomed to the immediate relief of her absolution. He tried to argue, but the strange, cold resolve in her eyes stopped him. He stumbled off, the heavy quiet of the house amplifying his failure. The spare room became his domain, a cold, unused space that mirrored the state of their marriage. Ellie found a strange sort of clarity in the solitude of her own bed. She started taking long walks earlier and earlier, before the true heat of the day could bake the dust into the road. She walked past the cemetery, past the old Baptist church and down to the docks. She watched the shrimpers heading out on the dark water, their boat lights small, hopeful stars on the horizon. During these walks, she began to understand that her constant forgiveness was not an act of strength, but a reflex of fear, the fear of being alone, the fear of change, the fear of failing the image of the good woman Willow Creek expected her to be. Her mama's words echoed, but now they sounded like a cage. A woman's heart is a garden. But she realized she'd been watering the fence, not the flowers. Ben tried to woo her back with grand gestures that felt cheap and late. A bouquet of bruised roses bought from the highway stand. A clumsy attempt to cook supper that ended with a smoke detector screeching and burnt okra. Ellie accepted the roses with a polite nod and ate the singed food without complaint. But her heart remained sealed off, a vault protecting the last scraps of her sanity. She realized that Ben didn't actually love her. He loved the result of her love, the comfort, the clean slate, the unwavering support that let him act like a consequence-free boy. The conflict was no longer between Ben and his conscience, but between Ellie's shattered internal world and the facade she had to maintain for the town. She hadn't told anyone she hadn't truly forgiven him this time. She kept the secret close, nursing the finality of her own internal break. Clara came over, bearing a pecan pie and worried eyes. "Ellie Mae, you look like a willow tree in a drought. You're wasting away for that man." Ellie sliced the pie, her movements precise and unnatural. "I'm just tired, Clara," she said. "Tired of watering sand." Clara leaned closer, her voice dropping to a porch whisper. "Honey, there's a difference between a woman with patience and a woman who's a doormat. You've let him take the sweetness right out of you. That truth landed with the dull thud of a dropped hammer. Ellie knew it was true. She had lost her color, her laugh had thinned, and her spirit felt heavy, like a stone in a silk sack. The forgiveness had hollowed her out, leaving only a shell dressed in her old clothes. The real Ellie was gone, eroded by repetition. She hadn't just forgiven his sins. She had paid the price for them, and the cost was her own vibrant life. The next morning, Ellie found Ben on the porch, staring out at the humid morning mist, holding her hand-stitched wedding quilt. He looked utterly defeated, not just sorry, but genuinely lost without her anchor. This was the moment of ultimate conflict. Her heart, the old, foolish, forgiving heart, threatened to beat one last time for him. He whispered, "I don't know who I am without you, Ellie. Please, just one more chance. I'll be the man you deserve. I swear it." The words were pure temptation, the siren song of comfort and the familiar path. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw not love, but a reflection of her own potential demise. If she forgave him now, it would be the final lie, the death of her self-respect. She saw the end of her story, a bitter, frail old woman waiting for a man who would never change. She didn't let go of his hand, but she didn't squeeze it either. She simply asked, "Ben, what do you need forgiveness for this time?" He looked confused. "For everything, Ellie. For the mill, for Sadie, for the shame." She cut him off gently. "No, I mean right now. What new trouble have you stumbled into since you asked last?" He stammered, his eyes darting away. The delay was her answer. He wasn't asking for forgiveness for the past. He was clearing the deck for the future, seeking pre-approval for the next mistake. This realization was the final nail in the coffin of her marriage. The delta heat knows the truth of a man, and Ben's truth was cyclical, never-ending. She finally understood that his repentance was just a phase, not a commitment. Ellie stood up, the quilt falling between them. It was a beautiful thing, covered in the wedding ring pattern, now lying like a casualty of war. She walked into the kitchen, pulled out a small old iron lockbox from the back of the pantry, and brought it back out. Inside were the meager savings she had kept hidden since they first married, a reserve for a rainy day she knew would eventually come. She placed the money on the table, not the lion's share, but enough for him to get his feet under him. She looked at Ben, who was watching the cash with an eager, calculating gaze, his remorse instantly forgotten in the presence of possibility. "This is yours, Ben," she said. "It's what I saved for a fresh start, and I want you to have one. Without me." Ben's face contorted, shifting from greed to confusion to a genuine, panicked anger. "You can't do this. We're married. You promised before God." His voice was loud now, echoing off the silent walls. "You always forgive me. That's who you are." Ellie felt a strange, light feeling, like she was floating just above the room. She was finally shedding the heavy mantle of the woman she was supposed to be. "No, Ben," she said, her voice clear as river water. "That's who I was. And that woman, the one who couldn't stop forgiving, that woman broke. She finally broke, and now there's just me." She packed a small bag. Not clothes, but her grandmother's silver locket, a worn leather-bound poetry book, and the deed to a small, isolated patch of land her uncle had left her, far up the river, untouched by Willow Creek gossip. He watched her, paralyzed by the unexpected strength. He tried to reason, tried to intimidate, tried to beg. "Where will you go? What will people say?" He clung to the community's opinion, the very thing he had disregarded for years. Ellie simply smiled, a real smile, small but definite, the first one that had reached her eyes in years. "They'll say what they always say, Ben. They'll say, 'Bless her heart.'" But this time the phrase wouldn't carry pity. She was reclaiming it. "They'll say, 'Bless her heart. She finally saved herself.'" She walked out the front door, leaving Ben sitting on the floor by the quilt, clutching a handful of money and the pieces of his shattered routine. The morning mist had burned away, and the delta air felt for the first time in a long time, free of suffocating expectation. Ellie didn't look back at the little house by the bend in the river. She walked to Clara's house, where Clara met her at the door, her eyes wide with understanding. "Where to, honey?" Clara asked, already holding out a thermos of hot coffee. "Upstream," Ellie replied, "where the water's running clean. I need to plant something new in my garden, and the soil down here is too poisoned." Clara nodded, a flash of fierce pride in her expression. The conflict was over, not with a bang, but with a firm, decisive walk away. Ellie stayed for 2 days, gathering provisions and Clara's unwavering blessing. They sat on the front porch, the world of Willow Creek turning around them, oblivious to the quiet revolution that had just taken place. They talked about crops, about the weather, and about everything but Ben. The silence regarding him was the loudest testament to her final decision. When she left, she didn't take the main road. Clara drove her as far as the old ferry landing, 20 miles north of Willow Creek. The ferryman, a silent old man named Thomas, knew her uncle's land and agreed to take her and her few belongings up the winding tributary. As the flat-bottomed boat pulled away, the landscape changed. The manicured lawns and neat rows of shotgun houses gave way to thick, untamed swampland, cypress knees sticking out of the black water like gnarled, protective spirits. The feeling of the swamp was primal and old, demanding respect but offering an honest sanctuary. Here, there were no neighbors to judge, no town to enforce its expectations of a forgiving wife. Here, the river was her only witness, and the river asked for nothing but quiet coexistence. She felt the tight knot in her chest finally begin to unravel. The land her uncle left her was a small clearing, high and dry, surrounded by towering pines and palmettos. There was a tiny, dilapidated cabin, weathered gray by decades of sun and rain. It was a place that required labor, and Ellie welcomed it. She started working immediately, clearing the weeds, patching the roof, and scrubbing the dust from the windows. The physical exhaustion was a balm to her weary soul, replacing the mental exhaustion of endless emotional management. She found a spring of sweet, cold water and she dug a small garden, planting beans and tomatoes. She slept better than she had in years, the silence broken only by the hoot of an owl or the splash of a fish. She was finally living a life where the consequences of her actions were purely her own, where no one else's betrayal could darken her morning. The creativity and energy that had been stolen by Ben's drama returned in the form of purpose. Back in Willow Creek, Ben was a rudderless ship. He had spent the money, expecting Ellie to reappear, to be driven home by fear or pity. When she didn't, he spiraled. He moved from the spare room to the sofa, drinking too much and letting the house fall into disrepair. The town, seeing her empty place at church and the neglect on the porch, finally shifted its pity from Ellie to Ben, but not with kindness. They saw a man undone by his own hand, a man who had finally exhausted his luck and his wife's grace. Clara was the only one who didn't shun him, but she also didn't help. She simply brought him a casserole once, looked at the mess and said, "A man is only as clean as the company he keeps, Ben, and right now, you're only keeping company with your poor choices." The Delta heat knows the truth of a man, and Ben's truth was finally visible to all. One cold, wet afternoon, about 6 months after Ellie left, Ben decided he couldn't stand the silence and the judgment anymore. He needed her to come back, not because he loved her, but because he needed her absolution to function. He borrowed a rickety old flatboat and set off up the river. Elara closed her eyes and, with the finality of a judge's gavel, made her payment. She didn't offer her life. She offered the memory. She focused on the purest, strongest memory she held. Silas, laughing in the sunlight, his face clear, before the fear and the debt had corrupted him. She pushed the image, the scent of his cologne, the warmth of his hand, out of her mind and toward the shadow. As she did this, she felt an excruciating psychic tear, like a root being violently ripped from the earth. The memory vanished, replaced by a hollow blankness. The moment the memory left her, the keeper's shadow surged forward, not in anger, but in satisfaction. The shadow accepted the payment, the essence of the pure memory. The moment the memory was taken, the keeper's shadow began to shrink, its dark material dissolving like smoke caught in a strong breeze. The chilling air rushed out of the room, replaced by the normal, thick, humid air of the Mississippi night. The intense, deafening silence lifted, and the ordinary sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the buzzing of a fly returned. The shadow was gone. The only things left were the untouched, opulent feast and the heavy silver fork, which had clattered onto the polished wooden floor. Leo rushed to his aunt, who sat perfectly still, her face pale but her eyes finally, truly empty of sorrow. She was free, but the cost had been absolute. 2 plates, always 2, but now the second one was merely a plate. Alara did not sleep that night. She watched the dark outside her window turn slowly to gray. The house felt lighter, cleaner, less burdened. She finally swept up the broken pieces of the chair spindle that had shattered when the keeper left. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the dusty kitchen window, Alara walked to the table. For the first time in 3 long years, she reached for a single plate, her own chipped, humble breakfast plate. She set only one place, 1 cup, 1 napkin, 1 knife. The empty seat across from her was just wood and air, warm with the morning sun, no longer humming with a consuming presence. The memory of Silas's laugh was gone, but so was the crippling need for his shadow. A final, thin layer of mist lifted from the surface of the Widow's Creek outside her window. The river kept its secret, but Alara had finally sealed the door to the house. Peace was not a return, but a quiet, singular beginning. He found the clearing just as the sun was setting, a beautiful, wild place, and he saw Ellie, not withered and broken, but strong and glowing, chopping wood with a powerful, steady swing. Her hair was pulled back, her face was weathered but clear, and she looked utterly content. The sight of her competence struck him with more force than any reprimand ever could. He pulled the boat onto the mud bank, stumbled out, and called her name, his voice ragged with emotion. "Ellie! I'm sorry. I'm fixed. I swear. This time I'm fixed." He ran towards her, holding out his empty hands, the hands that had taken everything. He was a mess, soaking wet and desperate, the antithesis of the handsome man who could melt ice. Ellie put the axe down slowly, the sound of the blade hitting the stump sharp and final. She didn't look angry. She looked completely detached, like a scientist viewing a specimen under a microscope. "Hello, Ben," she said, her voice even and calm. He started his practiced speech again, the beautiful, pathetic litany of remorse and promises. He talked about the loneliness, the cold sofa, the humiliation. He begged for the one thing he knew she always provided. "Forgive me, Ellie, please, just once more." It was the ultimate subconscious demand. He needed her to pay the emotional price one last time so he could feel whole. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the river and the distant cry of a hawk. She looked at him, and what she saw wasn't a husband, or a sinner, or even a man. She saw the vessel that had contained all her unused, wasted compassion, now discarded. "Ben," she said, and the way she said his name made it sound like a final period at the end of a very long sentence. "I can't. I truly can't. There is nothing left to give." She didn't rage or condemn him. She simply stated the fact of her total depletion. The forgiveness wasn't gone because she withheld it. It was gone because he had consumed the entire store. Her heart had run dry. The truth of her inner breaking was now visible. She pointed back toward the churning river. "The boat is still there. You need to go back the way you came." He tried one last time to cross the emotional chasm she had established, his face a mask of terror. He took a desperate step toward her, but Ellie took a step back, her posture unyielding. He realized then, in the wild silence of the upper river, that this time there was no home to return to, no clean slate waiting, only the long, hard journey back to the consequences she had left him with. He saw the cold resolve that had replaced the soft pity, and he knew it was permanent. He slowly retreated to his boat, his head bowed, not in theatrical repentance, but in genuine defeat. The delta heat knows the truth of a man, and that truth was a lonely, wet. Ellie watched him shove off, his figure quickly swallowed by the shadows and the swirling water. She didn't feel triumph, only a quiet, deep peace. She had finally understood that forgiveness is a gift, and a gift can only be given once it is truly deserved and truly received. Ben had only ever pocketed the gift, never truly accepted its responsibility. By refusing to give it one last time, she had, paradoxically, forgiven herself for every time she had offered it before. She was no longer defined by her husband's mistakes, but by her own decision to survive them. She walked back to her cabin, pulled the curtains tight against the encroaching night, and sat down by the small wood stove. She was finally whole, having traded the heavy cost of endless forgiveness for the simple, unburdened weight of self-love. The next time Clara came up the river, a few weeks later, she found Ellie laughing, truly laughing, as she hung jars of preserved tomatoes on a line. Clara didn't even have to ask about Ben. She saw the answer in Ellie's eyes, bright and clear as the mountain spring. "Well," Clara said, admiring the neat rows of the garden and the sturdy cabin. "Willow Creek is talking, of course." Ellie smiled, a woman fully reclaimed. "And what are they saying, Clara?" Clara took a long, slow sip of her coffee, looked out at the tranquil, green forest, and repeated the familiar, mournful phrase, but she tilted her head in a new way. "Oh, honey, they're saying, bless her heart, she did it again." But this time, Ellie Mae, Clara concluded, her voice full of pride and finality, "they mean she finally did the right thing by herself." Ellie Mae lived out her days in that clearing, a woman who had learned the hard lesson that holding on to a broken thing, even with the noble intent of forgiveness, can eventually break the holder. She never saw Ben again. The river carried him back to Willow Creek, where he became a cautionary tale, a man who lost the best thing he had because he mistook kindness for endless elasticity. He faded into the general landscape of the town's regrets. Ellie, however, became something else. A legend whispered on the porches, a folktale of a woman who was tested by fire and flood, and who only found her true strength when she finally recognized the cost of her own boundless grace. The delta heat knows the truth of a man, and it knows the greater truth of the woman who finally chose herself.